I don't know. I didn't see the countdown. Hi. Again, sorry, I don't know if you were just watching a few minutes ago. Technology, I have no idea what happened. Link just died. Everything went dead, but we're back. So I'm in long-term care residences all the time, obviously as a social worker, and I see some wonderful things in terms of staff interaction with clients. I also see horrible things. There are several places and experiences that come to mind where I literally would not even want to leave my dog there for an hour, like horrible things. But I've also seen some good things. But it's a common concern that families have. And last week when I was in a residence, I noticed a sign posted in one of the residences about surveillance cameras, just alerting everybody that cameras might be placed in residence rooms. Posted it on LinkedIn, and it's crazy. Over 20,000 views of that post, over 200 comments. People really, really find this as a hot topic. Should we have surveillance cameras? What about privacy? Who consents? Should they be hidden? Should they not? What are the laws? How do you use the footage? So I've invited with me today Areta Lloyd. She's an elder care attorney. She works in Toronto. She works at Dixon Appel LLP. She does estates, trust, and elder law, and she also has a focus on capacity law. Areta and I have known each other for a few years now. Appreciate you coming. Hi, Areta.
Hi, thank you for inviting me to discuss this really timely topic.
Yeah, really timely topic. So as an elder law attorney, how often do people, family members, come to you about potential abuse or exploitation?
Well, my practice spans more than elder law, so it's varied. But, invariably, there are conflicts reported, and it's really hard to know exactly what's going on unless there is something like a camera. I had a client whose father was falling all the time and they weren't catching it. And he was saying that they were just not around enough, or they weren't doing their job. Were they not doing their job? Were they just letting him be there for a long time? We don't know because we don't have a camera. So it's really hard to know what's really happening. Is it resident on resident violence? Is it employee violence? Is it a family member? You just can't know. So it's really interesting that the Quebec government has taken the initiative to allow cameras into residence rooms without notice to the long-term care home.
Yeah.
And this is, the reason this is such a big deal is because some of these homes may have unionized employees, and there's lots of intersecting rights here. So some unionized employees believe they have a right to privacy in the workplace. And so that's really an open question. In Quebec, in every province is different. It has been found in Quebec, though, that even if it's a unionized workplace, that, there has to be a reason for there to be a camera, and it has to be reasonably employed. So
okay, let's stop there for a minute. There has to be a reason, but who's the one who decides the reason? Because I, as a daughter, may say, I don't have a suspicion. However, my mom is in stage 4 dementia. There's no way she could tell me what's going on. So I just want to do this sort of proactively. Is that a reason, or do you have to have a suspicion or some incident prior?
Yeah, I can't really answer that because I'm not practicing in Quebec, but this is just from a perusal of the case law and the arbitration award in this area. I think that it should be in response to an incident or a suspicion. So that means there might be something like bruising or something else, right? However, what I think is that, if we use cameras all the time in our own homes, and long-term care homes are homes, there's been an evolution in how long-term care homes are perceived. So they used to be perceived as, institutions. And And so the rights of residents weren't sort of top of mind, I guess. And I know in Ontario that there's a Residents' Bill of Rights in the legislation, and the focus is on looking at the home as a home for residents. So it's very awkward because it's an intersection of a home and a workplace. But, let's just put it this way. There's no law that prohibits cameras.
Okay, so I'm going to take that down. No law that prohibits. I want to get back to what is their home. Okay, and also we had a comment by Stuart. Hi, Stuart. He's also a lawyer in California. He and I have known each other for several years as well. He practices in elder law. He was saying intersecting rights is an important issue. And I think we should get back to that too, about the rights of the staff versus the rights of the residents. When you're talking though about the home, this is the resident's home, that goes way beyond than just this camera issue, right? Because I see it often where the resident is in his or her room and the door is shut and staff just walk in. There's no knocking. There's a, hi, Mrs. Smith, may I come in? And people, I think we forget that this is where they live. It's the same thing as if someone's not going to just open my front door and walk in, right?
Exactly. So, you'll see the difference in, retirement homes, for instance, and long-term care homes, the way that people are treated. It's not a hospital, at least the door is their door. And exactly as you said, people need to respect privacy. Privacy, again, is a concept embedded in the Residents' Bill of Rights in Ontario. There should be a knock at the door. There should be permission to enter at that particular time. It is their home. It is not a hospital.
So let's stay on this about privacy, right? We should be. It's in the Ontario Bill of Rights. I would assume that Quebec has something like this. Other provinces, other states. Stuart, maybe you can answer if you're still watching, if California has a Bill of Rights. I imagine that most states or provinces in North America are progressive enough to have something like that. But on that piece of privacy, and let's go into this dementia angle. My mom, fourth stage Alzheimer's, let's say, in a residence. She has a right to privacy, but she can't actually say yes or no and consent yes or no to even me being there or the staff doing whatever intervention or the camera that might be there. So how do you, when it comes to these surveillance cameras, how do you know when you can do that if the patient can't actually verbally consent?
Okay, so, essentially, you always need the resident's consent if it's going to be in the resident's room. But when the resident cannot consent, the resident has a substitute decision maker. And therefore, the substitute decision maker gives consent or is the person who makes the decision to put the camera in the room. For instance, you're saying it's your mom, let's say you're her SDM, then you would make that decision and you're technically consenting. The issue comes when, there's, say, a roommate. So, you really want to tailor your use and the positioning of the camera to protect the person's privacy as much as possible. So you can get consent from the roommate or the roommate's substitute decision maker, but ideally you would make sure that the angle of the camera is facing away from the roommate to catch as little as possible of the other person so that you're not infringing on that person's right to privacy.
Okay, so then let's talk about the intersecting rights then with the staff. Okay, so that makes sense. There's a roommate. You want to angle the camera so it's only on, let's say, my mom's bed and my mom's area. Maybe the other family says it's fine, no problem. But now we've got staff coming in and different staff all the time. Do they have to then consent as well that they will be on camera?
No. So in a non-unionized setting, there's no sort of self-standing right to employee privacy in the workplace. It's different.
So wait, Areta, you were cutting out a lot, so I want you to start again that sentence because I missed the first piece.
So in a non-unionized workplace, or for non-unionized employees in a workplace, there isn't really a self-standing right to privacy in the workplace in terms of doing the work. Okay, so just qualify that a bit. You know, we're not talking about filming employees in their lunchroom or filming employees in the bathroom. This is not what we're talking about. We're talking about granny cams in a residence room where the employee is providing a service. They are working. So for unionized employees, there has been an expectation of privacy in the workplace. However, there are some decisions that have shown that, well, in response to a concern or legitimate suspicion that a camera reasonably employed should be okay. So what the Quebec legislation does is it just says it doesn't matter whether you have an expectation of privacy as an employee, the resident has a right to have a camera in their room, which is technically their home, to catch incidents of abuse. Or for instance, you know, some ministers have said in the Quebec government when they introduced this legislation that—
Oh, right.
Okay, sorry.
You're cutting up so much again, and I'm missing this whole piece. So I got the whole piece of unionized versus non-unionized. I got all that piece. And then you were saying what the Quebec legislation is saying, and then you started to cut out. Start that again for me.
The Quebec legislation is essentially saying that residents have a right to have a camera in their own home, in their own room, without giving notice to the home or to the employees, because the idea that catching abuse is paramount to considerations of employee privacy. But at the same time, I think I lost my train of thought there.
Okay, so let me pose another question. So in that spirit, so then that's in Quebec. Do you find that in North America, and again, Stuart, he's still there. Oh, well, he's saying up until this is California, Stuart Furman. Up until 2017, California did not allow cameras in rooms, even with resident consent. So maybe 2018, maybe it sounds like in 2018 they did. It was a licensing issue, he said. So I have a feeling that all of North America is going to be moving in this way. And I mean, truthfully, we all have we all have a camera in our pocket all the time. So, I mean, obviously though, then you're not catching something if you're not present, but we're all filming people all the time without their consent. So even if we don't have consent, or even if the employee didn't want to be filmed, can you still use that footage to do something like in a legal sense, even if somebody didn't consent, or does it get thrown out?
Well, you know, there are couple of different— one thing I really want to talk about is before we get to that is video and audio. Okay. So I don't think there's a real problem with video. The issue is that in Canada, the criminal code prohibits the recording of audio without the consent of one party to the conversation. So you can see how, in a situation like what we're discussing, that would be problematic during so many times of the day, right?
Right.
So that's why, you know, most elder care lawyers and advocacy groups will caution people not to turn on the audio. Okay. So I think that you want to be reasonable with when you decide to use a camera and how you decide to use the camera, to respect people's rights as much as possible and all the different actors involved. In terms of if you catch abuse on camera, how to use it. So every province, every state will have its own legislation guiding long-term care. And so, for instance, in Ontario, you can immediately go to the Ministry of Long-Term Care, Health and Long-Term Care, and they say that they respond to reports of abuse immediately. So they deal with the long-term care home. You can, if it's a registered health professional who is abusing the resident, you can, there are separate disciplinary procedures for registered health professionals. So that's a second route. You could make a criminal complaint. As far as whether it's admissible, depends on a number of factors. Like, this is not a question, admissibility of evidence, that we can unpack in this, forum. Like, this is complicated, and there's a lot of moving parts to answer that question. So, for instance, how accurate is the depiction on the video? Were there any alterations made to the video? So, courts, evidence needs to be admitted, needs to be accepted by the court. So you can proffer it, but then you need to get it admitted. So it's a kind of a technical process. And then there's all sorts of procedural rules in a trial about the admissibility of evidence. And that's why I'm saying, that's a really complex question.
Yeah, not something, it's not a yes or no.
No.
So supports that you need a specialist, you need an elder care attorney if you're going to bring this to the courts, because obviously there's a lot of layers of this. By the way, in California, Stuart also said it's a double consent state as to audio.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah. So do you think, Areta, obviously you wouldn't have stats on this, but do you think that the thought that there might be a camera changes people's behavior, and that there maybe less cases of abuse because people know that at any point they can be filmed?
Well, I'm not an expert in human behavior. So I would think that, I would hope it would make people think twice. I find that in my practice, people have, human nature tends to underscore its own foibles and vulnerabilities, and people are either really defensive and barge on ahead with denial in the face of proof, or they're reasonable, and it's just a function of personality, right? So I don't think that this is like a question that you can just blanket answer. It's going to be a function of the individual person's,
Yeah, I would agree with that. There's personality traits, right? So even though, this is off the topic of surveillance, but even myself, if I'm going to put something on social media and I know I'm a public figure, when I put something in writing, I'm reading it 2 or 3 times. I'm very careful, knowing that who knows who's going to take this and use it somewhere else. And same in my own clinical practice. When I'm writing responses to families and emails and lawyers, I'm very deliberate about what I'm saying, being very careful. So I guess I'm a reasonable person. So I do always think someone's watching, or maybe I'm paranoid. Maybe not reasonable, maybe it's paranoid.
Yeah,
but I think that people, they do change their behavior a bit, knowing that people are going to be watching.
And I think most people working in long-term care homes are good people. And it's really, I think we're seeing more reports of abuse, and certainly the demographics are changing, and there are definitely problems with that. I'm thinking about, the Elizabeth Wetlaufer case in Ontario. Remember that? The nurse who actually ended up killing that. She kept being shuffled to different homes, and she killed so many people, elderly people. It's, would a camera have helped? It would have been interesting if it would have helped, because she was injecting with supposedly medication. Who knows, right? If it would have helped in that case. But she was obviously a disturbed person, right? She had demons. So, I kind of find that you have these outliers, and then you have mostly pretty good, reasonable people. And I think that we need to look at, providing appropriate training, providing appropriate supports as well for staff. Just think of yourself as a caregiver, how burnt out you get. These are people's jobs, their livelihoods. Of course, I don't think most people want to endanger them, but it's a very difficult job. So, it's a multi-pronged answer.
Yeah, and I also think too that when you're talking about the use of cameras and you're talking about people should get training, what came into my mind was is that, and some of these were some of the comments on that LinkedIn thread I mentioned, that some people were talking about how staff could be watching other staff. And I think when we think surveillance cameras, we're assuming, oh, we're trying to catch somebody doing something wrong. But it could also be just part of training material. So it's not that I'm being abusive to Mr. Jones when I'm trying to help him stand up and the words I'm using are, you know, demoralizing to him. It has nothing to do with that. It's just that my technique I was using and the words and the combination at the time with a real live patient, not in the classroom with someone who doesn't have dementia, but real life situation.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe the cameras can help in training staff, not in a negative way saying you've done something wrong, but just these are the ways that we can improve. I mean, that could be actually something really positive that could come out of residences and the residence itself, meaning the facility itself, installing cameras to not watch their staff, but to help provide opportunities to find out where training needs to be given.
Yeah, I mean, again, then you're talking about privacy rights of residents as well, and their likely likeness and image being used for training purposes. And how do you, you know,
You sound like such a lawyer.
where do you start and end that process?
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's true. But I guess if, you know, if a facility has this and everyone knows and agrees, and when they come in, I mean, obviously recording is one thing, but we're in training hospitals. I mean, we're constantly in situations where people are training and learning. But I guess if everybody is aware that this is the place that they're moving in or living in, and that's just part of it. I mean, as a family member, that would not bother me. That would actually be a motivator for me for choosing a facility, thinking, oh, that facility is installing cameras. They're using it as training opportunities. How amazing. I know that they're progressive and proactive and really trying to provide the best care.
Well, I noticed one of the responses to your post, I think someone is a director, someone works in long-term care and says that they have cameras everywhere and they tell everybody. I mean, you have to tell them anyway. I mean, you have to post signs and you have to inform people and you have to make it obvious that you are recording, because someone has the right not to enter, you know, the building if they know they're being surveilled, right? But he was saying that they use this pro forma throughout.
As just standard. You're just saying something about having to inform people. I was in a file, this was many, many years ago, where one family member installed a hidden camera. It was in like a teddy bear. So I guess it's like a nanny cam because it's a teddy bear, but it was in a residence with the intention of not supervising staff or looking at staff, but actually they were concerned about another family member and how he or she was interacting with the patient. There was nobody approved it. There was no one told. It was all done in secret, yet that footage was used in the case in court. So I find that interesting that nobody knew, yet in this, I guess in this instance, it was still admissible. And as the social worker on the file, I had to watch the video. It was horrible. It was horrible to watch that interaction between two people.
Yeah, and you know, it's interesting because was the resident incapable to give consent?
Fully. Oh, yeah, fully, like very end stage dementia, non-mobile, totally bedbound. I think he was even hand fed, no verbal skills, like seriously, seriously vulnerable.
Yeah, and you know, a lot of times, like, you know, when we talk about these kinds of cases, you know, it's unconscionable for that kind of abuse to go on, right? And so, you know, this person, as the substantive decision maker, obviously made this decision and found something, and it was done in a way that it was able to be used. And again, as I said, you know, you may want to really understand the penalties around use of audio, but you know, honestly, if there's like a real suspicion, this person had a real suspicion, there's your reason to use the camera. And then again, as I mentioned, if you tailor it and you make sure that you're being quite reasonable about how the footage is collected, how much footage is collected, the extent of it,
Mm.
all of that, all those questions go into, are you tailoring your response to your suspicion as opposed to, wide angle lens catching everything, right?
Right. Yeah, no, I get that. It has to be related to the suspicion. Stuart, again, lawyer in California, elder care attorney, says, a problem I see in California, which is the litigation capital of the world, is that caregiving is hands-on. Caregivers are constantly touching the senior because they have to. Interpretations of the video can be misguided, and a claim for elder abuse will ruin the caregiver's life, as well as most likely put the facility out of business. That's true, because there is that interpretation. And that's where I think the audio can actually be helpful. Because if you're hearing the person, they're moving somebody and they're saying, come on, Mr. Smith, help me out here. I'd like you to move. And their voice is gentle. Then you have the interpretation, really, because you're hearing what they're saying. Whereas if you're watching them and seeing somebody pull somebody, just visually, you're like, oh, how aggressive. But if in their mind, their intention was to try and help, I don't know. That's where I guess that audio would be helpful.
Yeah, I agree. If there is, certainly there are exceptions to every rule, right? So
Right.
if it's the kind of thing, if it's the kind of abuse where, audio would be necessary, then I suppose, you could argue that. When you make these kinds of decisions, there's always risks and then there's rewards. So you are making that decision, right?
Yeah.
Nobody can tell you.
Yeah. So I'm sorry, I just cut you off. What was the last thing you said, Areta?
Well, it's a decision, it's a risk that you take, right? And it's a decision that you make as a substitute decision maker, or the resident makes the decision, and there obviously are consequences. So
Yeah.
nobody can make that decision for you.
Yeah. So just to wrap it up, if I am a family caregiver and I think that I want to install cameras, and if you can give a very general response for all of North America, so not specific, I don't want specifics of what's allowed or what's not, but as a caregiver in North America, I'm suspecting that something is happening in a residence. What steps should I take to ensure that if I choose to install cameras, I have the right to do so?
Well, first of all, I would suggest contacting an attorney in your state or your province to understand if there are any prohibitions on cameras, whether there are any notification requirements. That's the first thing. And then I would also underscore the audio piece. After that, if there are no prohibitions, then you may consider installing a camera. I would be very clear on the reason for that, how you intend to catch the behavior, and make it as tailored as possible and be as respectful as possible of not just the residents' privacy, but everybody's privacy around there. Keeping in mind, that this is a balancing act. That
is very succinct. That was perfect, Areta. Thank you. I think it's really clear. So obviously a specialist in your area, an elder care lawyer in your area, be cognizant of what the laws are, as if it's prohibited, what you have to do in terms of informing people, taking a look versus audio versus video, which can sometimes be different in terms of the law, and make sure that when you install, if you choose to, that you're respecting the rights of everybody who might be in that room and really trying to target that specific area or behavior. Yes?
Yes, and understand the pathways to discipline. So for instance, where is the problem? Is it with the home, and how do you address that? What are the rules and laws around that? Is it with a certain person who can be disciplined by their own profession? Is it a criminal offense? Is it all three? So understand the pathways. And this is where, discussing this with a lawyer is often very helpful.
Great. Thanks so much, Areta. I mean, there's other things to talk about in terms of what we can do as family caregivers preemptively before even getting to the thought of cameras. That's a whole other show, but I appreciate our focus on just the surveillance cameras and the things to think about. Eventually I'm going to have you come back. I also want to just talk about the most important documents that we should have to protect ourselves. Not today, but I'm going to have you come back, Areta, and we'll talk about that another time, okay?
Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure speaking with you.
My pleasure. Thanks, Areta.
Bye-bye.
Bye.